Dom, you're going to have to excuse the background noise here. I'm standing on my balcony here in Sharm el-Sheikh, and there is a bit of Arabic flute music going on in the background, which just started as we started recording.
As always happens, yeah, you've found yourself a backing band, Mark, but we'll try and work with it.
Finally. I'm Mark Stone in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, on an extraordinary, momentous, and at times truly head-spinning day.
And I'm Dominic Waghorn, Sky News International Affairs Editor in Jerusalem, in Israel, on a day that has been extraordinary and also full of emotion and full of really high drama. It's felt to me like several weeks just squeezed into just one day.
Yeah, Israeli hostages released, Palestinian prisoners too, aid into Gaza, the weapons falling silent. Trump then declaring peace in the Middle East. We will take you through the day, what happened, what it means, what next. Was this just a Trump show or the beginning of something much more profound? Dom, what a day, what a day.
What a day, and it has, and you've been saying this and I've been saying this, you know, no other president would have done it this way round. Any other president, if he has made a breakthrough in diplomacy in the Middle East, he would see how it lands, he would see how it played through, and then he might come here and take credit for it at some point in the future in a visit that would have been planned weeks in advance, or he might well have invited the main protagonist to come to the White House and shake hands on the White House lawn. He wouldn't have done, or she wouldn't have done, or no other American president would have done what Donald Trump has done, which was to come here on the same day as the hostages being released and the prisoners being released from Israeli jails, take credit for it, go to the Knesset, make a very long speech, and then go all the way to Sharm and meet 20 world leaders. It has been exhausting to cover and bewildering, really, because so much has been packed into one day. But so far, he seems to have pulled off quite an achievement.
Yeah, so many different moments in themselves would have been massive, massive stories. And yet we've had multiple moments like that. We've had the emotional with the release of the hostages after 2 years in captivity. We've had the joy of Palestinian prisoners reunited with their families. We've had the bizarre with Donald Trump greeting Gianni Infantino, the FIFA president. Why was he at this peace signing? I have no idea. We've had the awkward with Keir Starmer thinking that Donald Trump had called him up to the microphone. So up he comes, and then, oh no, Donald Trump doesn't need him there.
United Kingdom, where's the United Kingdom? Where's my friend? Come here. Is everything going good? Very good. That's very nice of you here. These people all came in like 20-minute notice, and I think it's fantastic. And we have so many others, and just so many others.
There have been so many different extraordinary moments. But ultimately, as you say, Dom, this was an event that could only ever have happened, and could only ever have happened in the way it did because of Donald Trump, right?
Yeah, and not to mention the apparently very significant agreement that was signed by Donald Trump with the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Egyptian president, and the leader of Qatar, I think, as well. And behind them were any number of other world leaders there to witness the signing of a document that we still don't know exactly what it was.
And there was a certain sort of subservient vibe going on throughout the afternoon here in Sharm el-Sheikh as well, because we had those leaders that you've just mentioned who were the key architects of this, in the sense that they, Qatar, Egypt, Turkey and America, were the negotiators who were here last week and have been involved in the negotiations to try and bring about this ceasefire, this peace deal of sorts. They were the ones that signed it, but then sitting behind them in this convention center in Sharm were the other world leaders who were kind of felt they had to be here, I guess. I mean, whatever they may think of Donald Trump as a character, and I'm sure privately they all have views, like, why would you couldn't shun this moment? I mean, he has done something incredible. He's got the hostages out. He's got the guns to stop. And then he wants to do it his way, which is to sign a document that no one knows anything about. But you kind of have to be here, whatever world leader you are, right?
What was the atmosphere like for you in Sharm? It must have been extraordinary. To collect that number of world leaders, as you say, and Donald Trump almost mocks them, doesn't he? He says on the one hand, a lot of people, all these guys here have got all this money and they're just sitting in these chairs. They're actually behind me. They'd rather be sitting around the table, but they're actually behind me. But then says how rich and powerful they are. So kind of mocks them, but also praises them. What was it like for you to witness that? It must have been an absolutely extraordinary event to be at.
Well, except that we weren't in the room because we were behind the scenes. We were in a press area, as is so often the case. We didn't get to go into the actual room itself. It was a very small number of pooled reporters who were traveling with the president, who saw all that unfold. But even being in the sort of outer orbit of this extraordinary moment, was something I won't forget. From the moment that Air Force One came into land at the airport, which is right next to the Sharm el-Sheikh Convention Center, even that was a show, because it wasn't just a plane landing. No, it was Air Force One flanked by fighter jets, which did a fly past. So it came in very, very low, straight over our heads with the jets, and then looped around. So the president literally did a victory lap over our heads, and then came into land on the second pass of the plane. So even that was an extraordinary sight to see. Then he was greeted by President Sisi on the tarmac at the airport, driven. The two of them both were in the Beast. Sisi hitched a lift in the back of Donald Trump's limousine, drove the 5-minute journey, if that, with an extraordinary backdrop. I mean, actually being there, Sharm el-Sheikh is kind of a shabby town, but they'd managed to frame the sort of optics to make it look absolutely stunning. That the mountain backdrop, the palace that's actually a convention center, the flags either side of this long avenue heading to the convention center. On television for the Trump show, it looked absolutely spectacular. And I tell you what, Dom, hats off to the Egyptian authorities, the Egyptian government, because they put together one heck of a summit. 30 world leaders, maybe slightly fewer, many other foreign ministers, and they did it all in just 2 days.
And what was frustrating, though, to talk about it more seriously, was obviously that this was a golden opportunity to have all those leaders there in a very narrow time frame. And of course, everything was kind of slightly sort of concertina towards the end of the day, because Trump had spent so long in the Knesset. He gave a very long speech, but also the speakers before him, the Israeli Prime Minister, the Knesset Speaker, and the leader of the opposition also gave very long speeches. So he didn't get to where you are, I think, until an hour and a half behind schedule. And then when he did, a lot of the time was spent, it seemed, and used up by him standing on a stage in front of a huge sort of, these words, Peace 2025 in front of him. And then each world leader having to go up and shake hands with him individually, one by one, sort of, individually, I guess, sort of expressing their kind of tribute to him and having a moment with him. But obviously that took a huge amount of time because there were so many world leaders there. When actually they had some very important diplomacy to get started, because as we've been saying all day, even though it's an extraordinary achievement, the release of these hostages and the Palestinian prisoners and the rest of it, actually that is the easy bit. It's been hard to do, but it is not as hard as what lies ahead, as we've been saying all day, as well on television. And you would have thought they would have tried to use that time where you are as effectively as possible, get their heads together and work out how the hell you do bring lasting peace to Gaza, and then beyond that possibly across the region. But it seems so much time was spent in this sort of frippery of the president having to meet each of these leaders one by one.
Yes, and that is why those who will argue, as I'm sure they will, in newspaper columns and on the airwaves over the days ahead, those that argue that this was nothing more than a Trump show and that it was, done by him, for him, to flatter him, they will point to the fact that there was no diplomacy, it seems, done at the moment in Sharm el-Sheikh at all. There was an expectation that there would be. I know that at one stage, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer planned to speak, and I think other leaders as well, presumably they planned to speak as well. So it would have been a moment, yes, to congratulate Donald Trump on what he had done and what he had achieved with phase one, with the ceasefire, the hostages, the prisoners, all the rest of it. but then to have the time, even a brief bit of time, to be able to express their views about what happens next and to kind of put their own mold on the next phases. But there was none of that. I mean, they literally were bystanders behind the president, listening to him, and then off they all went. Absolutely extraordinary. And for sure, I think an opportunity missed. But I don't think that takes away, whatever you think of Donald Trump, that takes away what he has achieved so far. I mean, he's done it in his own way with the show and all the rest of it, patting himself on the back. But Don, what we saw in Israel over the course of the morning with you just demonstrates what an achievement this is so far.
Yeah, we should go back, shouldn't we, to the start of the day, as you say, and that began for us in Jerusalem, watching pictures that our own team filmed actually in Gaza. The first sign of real movement in Gaza was a convoy of Land Cruisers, Red Cross Land Cruisers, that we knew already Hamas had transferred the first batch of hostages to. They got into these Land Cruisers, and then our team on the ground there, who obviously have done a heroic job for 2 years, covering this war and all that they've witnessed in those 2 years. They managed to get into the convoy. They had an extraordinary shot following it through the devastated hellscape that is Gaza. And then we watched those vehicles then make their way through southern Israel. The roads were lined with cheering crowds, and then we got the first glimpses of the hostages as they were transferred into helicopters, some photographs of them looking happy and obviously very, very relieved and smiling as they were hugging friends there. Some of them reunited with their families down in Re'im, the military base there, but others were then reunited with the families after a helicopter ride up to the hospitals that they were taken to on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, and then these extraordinary scenes that we've seen inside the hospitals. And for me, the picture of the day, we've seen a lot of very emotional reunions, of course, over the last couple of years as hostages have been released from Gaza. But there was an extraordinary moment when Guy Gilboa Dalal and Evyatar David, who were childhood friends, who were at the Nova Music Festival. They were both abducted there by Hamas, kidnapped and dragged off into Gaza. They were held for most of the time together, and then 2 months ago they were separated. And just the raw emotion of them running down the corridor in the hospital that we went to a few days ago, and just hugging each other, grabbing each other's heads, staring each other in the eyes, just tugging their cheeks, not quite believing they were seeing each other. Very powerful pictures, and we'd also just seen pictures of Guy himself being reunited with his family in very emotional scenes as well, his sisters jumping up and down. Really overwhelmed with joy. So, really emotional scenes we've seen in the hospitals in Israel. And then we've seen emotional scenes in Gaza, of course, and on the West Bank as Palestinian prisoners and detainees have been released by the Israelis. And we've heard from Gazans talking to our teams again in Gaza, saying how difficult and how hellish Israeli jails have been and how they feel reborn by being released. So, a day of extraordinary emotions across Israel and the occupied territories, and a day of really high drama.
Dom, I know you've covered hostage releases in Israel before and prisoner releases from the West Bank as well. But I guess the difference here was the scale, right?
Yeah, we have seen batches of prisoners released. We've seen a lot of Palestinian prisons. There are always more of them than there are Israeli hostages released.
Dom, why is that? I mean, people might find that confusing. Why so many Palestinians for far fewer Israelis?
I think that's just the currency of the Israeli hostages. For the Israelis, they are prepared to pay a bigger price. They are prepared to hand over more Palestinians in return for just one Jewish Israeli hostage. If you remember Gilad Shalit, he was exchanged for many other, for a far greater number of Palestinians. And amongst their number was Yahya Sinwar, who then turned out to be the mastermind of the October 7th attacks. So, it's something that's hard to explain and understand, particularly for those outside of Israel, but it's something the Israelis have been happy with in the past and have been happy with again today. But it's deeply controversial, of course, because a lot of these prisoners released, there were 250 Palestinians, most of them serving life sentences, many of them for horrendous acts of terrorism and atrocities they've carried out. And I think, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but I don't think that takes away from the unbridled joy and also a sense really of national catharsis and a sense that this sort of agonising ordeal that obviously the hostage families have gone through has been shared to a certain extent across the country, and therefore, that national torment has come to an end today.
Yeah, Dom, I know you've got to go and do your live on the television very shortly. Just talk to us briefly about the Knesset, that moment, because again, another sort of massive news moment in itself. Donald Trump addressing the Knesset.
We could talk all evening about that extraordinary Knesset event. We have seen American presidents obviously revered as heroes and welcomed here. You think of George W. Bush, you think of others, and we've seen them adulated, but we've never seen anything on the level that we saw today. And Donald Trump walked into the Knesset chamber to a standing ovation.
Donald J. Trump.
That was the first of, I think, 22 standing ovations that he got through his speech and the other speeches around them. He was compared to Cyrus the Great Persian leader who saved and released the Jewish people from bondage in Babylon in ancient times. They then came back here and built the Second Temple. He was given an award, the highest award you can get as a civilian in Israel. He received extraordinary speeches from the Speaker of the House, from the leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, and from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And then he began speaking. And all those speeches went on quite a long time, as he was pains to point out later when he said, "I'm going to be very late. I'm not sure there's any." He said, "I'm not sure there's going to be anybody left for me to see in Sharm el-Sheikh by the time I get there." And then he gave this speech, which was full of passion, very much taking the credit. There was a certain amount of humour as well. There were heckles, there were protests. Two Knesset members had to be bundled out of the chamber, having interrupted the speech. And in this speech, he made this commitment really very clear that as far as he's concerned, this deal, which so far is a ceasefire and a prisoner and hostage exchange agreement, is, in his mind at least, the beginning of something much bigger. He said this was a new dawn for the region, and he is, I think, predicting a total change in the way the region operates, from one of war and terror. A conflict he says has gone on for centuries is coming to an end. So full of exaggeration and hyperbole, but at the heart of it, I think, an American president who is committed to give what he can, give his all to try and make this work. And he made it pretty clear that he had said to the Israeli Prime Minister, this war is doing Israel no good anymore, clearly not doing American interests in the region any good as well. You can't fight the world forever. From before he said to the Israeli Prime Minister, and therefore he's called time on this war. But he certainly believes and has made it clear that this is something that he believes he can build on, not just for Gaza, but for Israelis and Palestinians, and possibly for the region beyond.
And I think that's a really important point. He does, for a president who is known to have a short attention span, can move on to different issues very quickly. He can get fed up if things are not going his way and just drop things. I'm not so sure that he will drop this one because he's attached himself so closely to it. I don't know what you think, but it feels to me that for, either whether it's because of the Nobel Peace Prize or his desire to further the Abraham Accords, normalization between Israel and other Gulf Arab countries, for a variety of reasons, I feel like he might hold on to this and try and drive it through to its stage 2, stage 3 conclusions.
I think to many people watching the Knesset this morning, it will have been a nauseating mutual appreciation fest. To a lot of people, they'll have watched an Israeli Prime Minister they regard as being guilty of genocide, being lauded by an American president who helped him carry it out until he decided that time was up. Not everyone sees it that way, but I think many people will. They will have found it very hard to stomach, actually. But whatever you think of Netanyahu, whatever you make of Donald Trump, you have to say at the end of this, there's a fair amount of good news. The war is over, the hostages are out, aid will undoubtedly go in. The question is, can it go into the right places? It's a chaotic place now, Gaza. Will it just be hijacked? But aid is going to go in. It's hard to see now this war starting again. Hamas is definitely not going to give up. It's not going away. We've already seen in pictures filmed by our team today, Hamas fighters lining up in black uniforms with their guns, parading their fighters. It is not disbanded like Donald Trump says. It's not disarmed. And obviously, this isn't the total victory that Benjamin Netanyahu promised his people, because his enemy still exists. But there's a limit to what Hamas can do. They can keep their weapons, they can parade them. They will try and reassert control over as much as Gaza as possible. What they can't do is renew hostilities. They can't block the introduction of an international security force, because that would lead to Trump green-lighting Israel going back to war. And it's pretty clear he said to Israel that this is it. You can't carry on with this. And he's reassured and told Hamas that they have his word. Israel won't attack them again. If Hamas goes too far, if it reduces hostility, if it attacks Israel again, if it blocks any efforts now to bring in international security or a governing interim body, then that's obviously going to be a red line for Donald Trump. But for now, the war is very much over. And the other big thing, I think, Mark, is that what's happened now is that Trump has internationalized the conflict and also ways of resolving it. It's another of those things. Not so long ago, both you and I probably would have said it would be unthinkable for Arab countries to agree to send troops or Turks or Indonesians to stand in Gaza and try and keep the peace. That is now conceivable. And this is an American president, for all his faults, who does make the inconceivable conceivable. Frankly, just through sheer force of will and self-confidence. And that is what he's brought to this conflict and efforts to resolve it.
Sheer force of will, self-confidence, but also things like tariffs. He pressures people, he persuades them, he makes them get on side by threatening something. And I think that actually, when you take a step back, the bigger picture, that is why we saw this sort of subservience today. That is why people kind of felt they had to be here, because he's so unpredictable, and they feel like, that's the way he's kind of drawn everyone in. And he'll say to Indonesia, put a few troops into Gaza, I'll give you something for it. It's purely transactional. But it may well be that. It could also be the case that it is a good thing as well, that we are in the position that we are now. There was one key moment of symbolism that I thought was fascinating today, Dom, and that was the moment when Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, met Donald Trump. It's only the second time they've ever met. They first met in 2017 during the first Trump term. And to make it all the more symbolic, because Mahmoud Abbas is such an elderly man, he's not particularly fit. It was Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who literally helped him up the steps and kind of pushed him into the hands of the American president. That was very symbolic, I think, because Donald Trump then clearly recognized that moment and chose to spend longer with Mahmoud Abbas than he did with any other of the leaders who were there. Read into that what you will, but for me, I thought that was an important moment to see.
I think, Mark, you're right. I think it's symbolic of the way that it's human relationships and the connection between these leaders that's going to be very important. We do have a moment now when all these leaders have been gathered. They're all very committed financially to do what they can for Gaza. It is a genuine window of opportunity, I think, now. It is disappointing. It hasn't led to any kind, it seems, of meaningful diplomacy in Sharm.
Not yet.
But
not yet.
No, but I think there's a lot of momentum potentially behind this effort, and certainly we have an American president who's fully engaged now and trying to engage his allies and regional partners, and we'll have to see where it goes. For whatever Hamas does now, I think there is a window of opportunity in Gaza, and it's up to world leaders to seize that moment.
It is, and they, on the face of it, up front, at least publicly, they are all leaning very much into this. Privately, they may think, my goodness, that was a Trump show, wasn't it? It was a show of the type that only Donald Trump could put on. But publicly, they recognize the good news that has come out of today, and they need to lean into whatever's next. And Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, I got an eye roll from her. She's good at that. When I said, do you think Donald Trump will stick the course on this? Of course he will, she said. But she also had this, her reflections of the day. Prime Minister, how hopeful are you today that Donald Trump will stay the course on this huge challenge?
I'm quite optimistic. But the main thing is that we are ready to give him and the others all the end that is needed. Italy is there and is ready to be there for this is a very big occasion, but we have to work on it. We have to work on it a lot. So you can count on Italy.
Do you think President Trump understands the challenge?
Yes, obviously.
I think, Mark, it's important to point out to viewers who are sort of slightly baffled and bewildered by what's happened, as I think we all are over the last week or so. What Trump has done is deliberately ripped up one of the golden rules of Middle Eastern negotiating, which has always been there's no deal until a final deal. Nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. And what they decided, more pragmatic, transactional and unconventional, as you say, very unorthodox diplomacy. I mean, described as one Israeli commentator as bullying diplomacy. But they've kind of reinvented how to do diplomacy in the region, which is that you agree on what you can agree on. You agree on what is realistic, although it's pretty hard to get there. But once you've done that, you've agreed it, and then you try and sort out the rest later. Now that has worked because it has led to an extraordinary achievement today. These hostages coming out, the end of the war, a ceasefire, Palestinian prisoners being released. But the problem now is that those more difficult challenges now loom large, and they have to be resolved fairly quickly. And they include, obviously, what happens to Hamas, whether it should be disarmed, how you create a transitional authority in Gaza to replace Hamas. It's been under the kind of Islamist jackboot, if you like, of Hamas for many years, since 2007. The outside world has got to create an alternative to that, and that governing body is going to be essential to that. And how do you send in a multinational peacekeeping force to provide security? That involves a huge amount of diplomacy and international cooperation that we haven't seen enough of yet. But, there is an opportunity, but it's one that will start narrowing if this moment and this initiative isn't seized by Donald Trump and all those leaders who've been pledging their support and all their money as well, of course, to him, where you are today in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Yeah, Dom, just as we were leaving the summit, I bumped into an Egyptian news anchor. He introduced himself as such. He was kind of the Ron Burgundy of Egypt, I think. He had the suit. He had the limo. He was Ron Burgundy or Brett Baer. I don't know which of the two, but he's clearly well connected. I didn't recognize him, but he introduced himself. He said to me, "What do you think of today?" And I said, "Well, it was kind of bewildering." And he said it was a Trump show, nothing more. He was absolutely disgusted. I could sense by what he had seen. He said Trump just got Egypt to put on a summit that would usually take weeks and weeks, maybe months to put on, and all he did was talk about himself. So that was his view. And I said to him, "Look, but maybe peace is breaking out in the Middle East. Maybe," he said, "but we've got a long, long way to go yet."
And I think in saying that, he probably sums up the feelings of many, many people across the region who will be deeply sceptical of what they've seen. They'll see an Israeli prime minister they regard as genocidal being, as I say, supported and lauded in an obscene way in the Israeli Knesset by an American president who's given him a huge amount of leeway to carry out that alleged genocide. But it doesn't take away from the fact the hostages have come home. The war is over now, and there is now a chance for Gazans to go back to what remains of their homes and start rebuilding their lives and aid to get in. But none of that will really add up to much unless they can build on this achievement now and end this war for good and give the people of Gaza and the region something really to hope for, a better future. There is an opportunity, but they've really got to seize that moment.
Yeah, so it is hard to overstate the symbolism of this past day, but it's much more than that. The achievements genuinely are big. Trump is a showman, of course he is, and today there was all of that. It was ego boosting for him and designed by him to be just that. But it's also true that he absolutely moved the dial. He ended the war. He's forced everyone together. This was peace today, but the days ahead will be much, much more challenging. And of course, as we've been saying, Dom, he needs to stay the course. That was Trump 100 on a truly extraordinary, momentous day. Dom, you're heading back to London now?
We'll be here for a bit longer. We're going to do an investigation into who exactly is running Gaza. Is it Hamas or is it militias and clans? We'll see how events go. It's an unpredictable region, as you say, but I think, if things go back to some kind of normality, then we'll be heading home at the end of the week, yeah.
And Donald Trump has already announced that he will be focusing elsewhere by the end of the week. He's got so many challenges. He's moving us all from one big challenge to another, because on Friday he will have another meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine, Russia, that challenge. We will be back over the course of the next couple of days. Who knows when, given the rate of news at the moment. But thanks for listening. Dom, see you very soon.
Thank you, Mark. Good flight back home.